one of the best compliments anyone ever paid me was a guy said into a very crowded room, if you want something done, tell Bob Yates it can't be done. As policymakers, it's up to us to figure out ways where we can ensure that Boulder is welcoming and inclusive to people who want to live here, but doing it in such a way that that either doesn't impact people who live here, or it does impact them, but it impacts them in a way that they are comfortable with. On the other hand, as elected official, you also have a duty of leadership. Yeah. And sometimes that means the majority doesn't prevail. If majority always ruled in this country, we wouldn't have human rights, we wouldn't have civil rights, we would trample on the human and civil rights of the minority, and that's not our tradition.
We ain't throwing starfish here, now we're having a good party. Talking about structural change. We believe the land is sacred, even beneath that vacant parking lot, where the weeds are doing their best to express the need for something different. Gonna make some space for you and me to live here all together. Gonna make it safe and fun for kids to get around the town. Gonna find me a residential pedestrian district where I can gracefully grow older. Gonna spend my remaining years sharing Boulder.
Hello, Boulder and the wider world. This is the Sharing Boulder podcast. My name is Philip Ogren, and for episode 34, I spoke with Bob Yates, who is a member of Boulder's City Council and is running to be Boulder's first directly elected mayor this fall. We met at a park near his house in North Boulder and talked about a wide variety of subjects, including the possibility of building a gondola that connects downtown to the hill, observations from his recent travels to Budapest, accessory dwelling units, the role of elected officials and Bob's leadership style, occupancy, the new down payment assistance program, the need to pay City Council a living wage, among others. Bob is perhaps best known for his monthly newsletter, the Boulder Bulletin, which is distributed to over 7,000 subscribers and is filled with interesting stories and detailed rationales for his policy positions. We hope you enjoyed this conversation with Bob Yates. Hi, Bob. Welcome to Sharing Boulder. Thanks so much for coming on to the podcast. Do you mind introducing yourself?
Sure. I'm Bob Yates. I've served on City Council for the last 8 years, since 2015. And this year in 2023, I'm running to be Boulder's first directly elected mayor.
Awesome. Well, good luck. We've got not a crowded field, but we have a competitive field with you, Aaron, and Nicole. You gave a bit of your resume to a meeting I was at recently, and it's very impressive. And one thing that you said that kind of sparked my interest and kind of like a little neuron that had gone dormant was talking about the gondola, which you didn't make as like a major plank of your platform, but I had just forgotten about that. And I thought that'd be a fun thing to start off with, is just talk a little bit about the gondola and your interest in it.
Let's go with gondola. That's great. That's great. You know, I don't know much about gondolas myself, but I went to a conference I think it was in Montreal a few years ago, and there was a gondola guy there, and he was talking about the benefits of gondolas, and I learned a lot about gondolas, and I followed up with him, and since then I've learned gondolas are really, really cool transportation. They're obviously iconic and they're fun, and obviously they're used on ski slopes and other places, and they're pretty prevalent in South America. There's a lot of hilly countries, hilly cities that have found that gondolas are often the cheapest and most efficient modes of transportation.
Yeah, I know there's some in Bogota.
There are, I've ridden them in Bogota and other places in South America, and for whatever reason they haven't really super taken off here in the United States, although there are some cities that are looking at it. And where the convergence is potentially for Boulder is, the University of Colorado is building a big conference center up on at Grandview and Broadway, up at the top of the hill. And it occurs to me that, those conferences are going to attract a lot of people. 600, 800 people will go to a conference, and at 4:30 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon during a conference, all those people are going to walk out the door and say, now what do we do?
Let's go to Half-Ass Subs.
Exactly. And Half-Ass Subs is a great place, but it's only so big, or Cafe On. And so, it would be really great if we could figure out how to get people up and down the hill. Whether they're conference attendees, whether they're people who are downtown who might want to go up to the hill, whether the people that are on the hill want to come down to downtown. Now, you and I can walk and bike up that hill. We know that's not a big deal. But for people who are from out of town, they may not be familiar with our geography.
It's also not a beautiful walk.
It's not a beautiful walk.
It's not easy
it's a
either.
little uncomfortable on Broadway. It's pretty busy. We could certainly run more buses up and down Broadway, but Broadway is pretty congested as it is.
Yeah.
And one thing I've noticed is that tourists or visitors often don't use public transportation. They're intimidated by it, especially buses. Exact change, and where does it go, and how do I stop the bus, and all that.
Yeah.
So I kind of tied those two things together. This kind of new knowledge of how gondolas work and how many people they can move in an hour, and the idea that we have this hill that we need to get people up and down. So I've kind of proposed this, as you say, this is not the centerpiece of my campaign. It's just something that I've kind of toyed with over the last few years. The city actually did a study of the feasibility of a gondola. I'm going to say it was right during COVID, right around 2020. They received a grant from an outside organization, so they used that money to study it. And it does work. It's actually very feasible. You put a tower up top, tower down bottom, bring people up and down the hill.
It's just two stops.
Two stops. One at or near Pearl Street, one near the conference center, and you're done. It's only about 2,500 feet. You could probably do it in about a minute and a half or 2 minutes.
And is this something that you run on special occasions, or it's kind of like your regular service?
Regular service,
yeah.
and actually could be a mode of transportation too. I mean, it's iconic and it's fun and it's something for visitors, but I think it could also be something for those of us who live in Boulder.
Yeah.
I think to make it successful, you'd have to either make it free or very cheap.
Yeah.
Because if you made it $5, people would do it that live here in Boulder would do it once. And that would be it, right?
Yeah.
But if you made it $1 or 50 cents or free, if you gave the students all free passes.
Yeah.
I also see it as a potential safety measure for kids who come, they come downtown, they have a few beverages in the evening, and then they need to wander back up the hill. And I always worry, especially for women, about going up that hill. It's dark, it's late, people have been drinking, and if we could get that gondola running, at midnight, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the morning, to get people safely back up to the top of the hill.
Well, I love that. I'm pro gondola.
Good, yeah.
For the record, I think that's amazing.
It's a big expense. Gondolas of that size would cost about $10 million, and that's not an insignificant amount of money. But from an operating standpoint, they're very, very inexpensive. Once you make the capital investment, you have a couple guys at each end for safety. They're all electric. You can run it on solar. They're very environmentally friendly. So there's no buses. There's no traffic congestion. And they can move like 10,000 people an hour.
That's amazing.
And so you really can move large volumes of people very, very quickly, depending on how many cabs you put on. And those who visited Portland have seen how they work. Obviously, some of our mountain towns have gondolas.
I have been to Portland, where it's actually really useful.
It is.
It's not just a tourist trap. It's like a
my sister-in-law rides it every day. She works at the hospital up on the top of the hill, and that's her commute. She goes to the bottom of the gondola. She rides it up the top of the hill. She's got a pass. It doesn't cost anything.
Well, I can imagine there'll be a lot of workers on the hill that it would make it easier to ride a Flatirons Flyer to downtown.
Yeah.
And then one more little gondola push up the hill to work.
Well, and we're looking to continue to revitalize the hill. The two new hotels coming in, I think, will help with that. We get 2 million visitors a year to Pearl Street. If we could get a fraction of those people who are on Pearl Street to jump in, I can imagine a tourist who's walking up down Pearl Street, they're enjoying Pearl Street, they see a gondola up there, they say, oh my gosh, I wonder where that goes. They walk over there, they find out it's 50 cents, they say, what do we have to lose here? They get on the gondola, they go up and they discover the hill.
Is there a model where the businesses on the hill could finance the gondola?
Sure. I think the financing for the gondola, the construction of the gondola, could come from a number of sources. Certainly, the business improvement district, either downtown or there's an organization up on the hill, could help with that. I think the city should play a role in that. I think the university should play a role in that. So I'm less worried about where the funding comes from, because once they're built, they're actually very, very inexpensive to operate. Yeah. And from a feasibility standpoint, the cash flow works just fine, even at 50 cents or $1 a ride. I think the key is do we have the vision and courage to say, hey, let's put this iconic thing here on the side of our hill. I could see some people who might be worried about view shed, blocking my view of the mountains, or they just don't like the concept of another new strange things. And so I think this is going to require some degree of vision, enthusiasm, imagination. There are several groups in town that are actually advocates of the gondola. The Downtown Boulder Partnership just finished its strategic plan, and they're enthusiastic about a mode of this type. Convention and Visitors Bureau is supportive, the Boulder Chamber is supportive. So you got a lot of organizations in town who say this could be kind of a cool thing. not the centerpiece of my campaign.
Yeah, well,
but,
I know.
But every once in a while, everyone knows me as Gondola Bob for some reason, and so
I had totally forgotten about that. I didn't know that was a nickname, and yeah, I know there's a housing crisis and a climate crisis.
There's lots of things.
Lots of things to talk about. But I appreciate you
we can have fun.
indulging me a little bit.
Yeah, we can have fun.
Yeah, I think that would be really fun to. I actually did e-bike tours last summer.
Yeah.
I got to see the city through the eyes of a tourist because we would meet in North Park and do a tour through the city and something like a gondola would be a really great way to make the Pearl Street a little less one-dimensional.
Yeah.
And
why not?
Why not?
I think
that'd be cool.
Have fun with it.
All right, so I understand you went to Budapest recently. I was reading about it last night because I assume it's a world-class European city. You wouldn't go there for lots of reasons to go there. I found out that the population density is about twice Boulder's in a space that's maybe 8 times the size of Boulder. So it must have been ghastly. So I wonder, what, as mayor of Boulder, what recommendations would you give to the mayor of Budapest to make their city more,
right.
less crowded? And I'm being a little facetious. Sorry.
Sure, no, that's fine. First of all, just the reason we went to, I'd never been to Budapest before, and my wife and I are celebrating our 40th wedding anniversary this summer. We got married in July of 1983, so we're coming up on 40. And so we have a city council break in the middle of the summer, so we took advantage of that and went to Budapest. It is a beautiful city. It's historic, it's old. They've done a great job of preservation. It is dense, but I don't think it's dense in a bad way at all. I spend a lot of time in New York City where my 2 sons live, and that's obviously a pretty dense place as well. And I think that density certainly works in certain areas. Boulder, we're obviously struggling with that. Should we become more dense, which would allow more people to live here, people who work here to live here? Yeah. But how do we do that in a way? Because Boulder was, unlike Budapest or New York, which were built out a long time ago, and then density was just the thing you did, right, in the 19th century and the early 20th century because it just made economic sense. Boulder was developed later, right?
Yeah.
Most of Boulder was developed effectively. I mean, even the city dates to 1859. The city was really, really small until after World War II. And it was really the 50s, 60s, and 70s where the population took off. And
cars are
cars were king.
Motive.
Cars were king, and people wanted big lots, single-family houses where you would drive everywhere, and that was just the culture in the 50s and 60s and 70s. Sorry, I keep doing this. There's mosquitoes out this morning.
I keep actually wanting to swat your shoulder. Because,
That's fine. That's fine. And so we now have that legacy that we're dealing with right now, and now it's 2023, and we have the legacy of the 50s and 60s and 70s to deal with. And so the question is, what do we do? Do we just say, hey, listen, we're just going to live in a town that was created in that era and that culture? Or are there things we can do to increase density and increase occupancy opportunities for people to live in Boulder? There was a measure done a few years ago, I don't know if it's still accurate, because it was before COVID, where Boulder's population, which is right around 105,000, there's an additional 60,000 people who commute into Boulder, who can't, either choose to live outside of Boulder or more often can't afford to live in Boulder, right? And a lot of those are students. People think, oh gosh, the university has 35,000 students roughly. Those people all live in Boulder. About a third of them can't afford to live in Boulder either, right? They commute in from distant places, especially graduate students. And so it's a concern. It's a negative about our town, the fact that we're so expensive and unaffordable, and that people who want to either to work here or go to school here can't afford to live here. And so they have to, either jump in cars or use public transportation to schlep here, which is a huge time suck, takes time out of their personal lives, not great for the environment.
Terrible for the environment.
And it damages our sense of community and cohesion. It would be, in a perfect world, everybody who worked here or went to school here would live here, right? Yeah. We would all be part of this community 24 hours a day, as opposed to you're welcome to come here 8 or 10 hours a day, and then you need to go someplace else. Yeah. And so I think, therein lies I think the struggle that Boulder has dealt with, at least in the 22 years that I've lived here, which is, where's that balance? How do we create housing opportunities for people who want to be here, particularly people who work here or go to school here, but without doing it in such a way that people who are already here, who kind of like their neighborhoods and kind of like how comfortable it is for them, how do we do that in a way that doesn't upset them but also provides opportunities? I don't think those things are mutually exclusive, and I think there's lots of things that we have been doing and can continue to do to create housing opportunities without upsetting people or hurting people who already live here.
But I guess one thing I just wanted to kind of circle back on with respect to Budapest is that I haven't been there, so I have been to some European cities.
Right.
But my assumption is that, like, when you're down in the Central District, the UNESCO World Heritage Site, it's awesome. And when you're there, you're thinking, oh, I can imagine how wonderful life would be if you could stay and work and live in a place like this. Is that true?
Absolutely. My wife and I actually had that conversation. We're like, we could live here. This is great. It's beautiful. It's historic. It's UNESCO World Heritage Site. There's a river that runs through the Danube. There's wonderful bridges. They have an island in the middle of the river. It's called Marguerite Island, which has been kind of set aside as effectively an open space. So it's a giant park. It's dozens of acres. You ride bikes. We rode our bikes through it and that kind of stuff. And so it's really it's nice in that you have the urban atmosphere for sure. It's the capital of the country. So you've got the Parliament building, and you got some old historic royal buildings from the Middle Ages. And there's a big hill. So Budapest actually is two cities. It's Buda and Pest, and they're two different cities.
I did not know that.
And up until I think about 150 years ago, they were actually twin cities. It's like Minneapolis, St. Paul, right? Nice. Or Brooklyn and New York and Manhattan. They were across the river from each other, but they were separate cities. Buda is up on the hill. It's on the south side of the Danube, and it's up on the hill. And it's a hilly town. It was the royal town. There was a certain character to it. And then Pest was a little bit more, I'll use the word suburban, but I'm talking about maybe Middle Ages suburban, right? Sure. It was where a lot of people lived and the merchants lived and so on and so forth. And they started building, when technology developed, it was ferries initially, and then they have a bridge there called the Chain Bridge, which was built slightly before the Brooklyn Bridge was built. The technology jumped forward in the middle of the 19th century. It's a steel bridge, but it looks a little bit like the Brooklyn Bridge, and so that was the first bridge, and now they've got lots of bridges. And so the towns started to kind of come together, and then I think it was around in the 1870s they actually merged, and now it's Budapest, and so it's one town. And so and when we were there, we stayed on each side. We stayed a couple days on the Buda side and a couple days on the Pest side, and even though they're like literally a few hundred yards apart with the river in the middle of it, very culturally different. Just as Brooklyn is very culturally different from Manhattan.
Interesting. Thank you for sharing that. Well, so one of the things that I think is the challenge of like selling density to Boulderites is, like I don't want bad density. There's lots of examples of horrible density around the world.
Right.
But I also, and actually to just, say I don't want bad density, I want great density. Like I would love Boulder to become a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Like how can we build Boulder up in such a way that people would just be like, oh, this is great density.
Right.
So maybe just speak to that if you.
There's actually and before we turn off the camera, I do want to. You made me think of something. When I ran for re-election in 2019 for council, one of the questions were you at the Chamber of Commerce was usually has one of the early candidate forums, and it would have been the end of August 2019. And one of the questions, and the nice thing about that forum, some candidate forums you don't get the questions ahead of time, so you just do the best you can on the fly. But that one they gave the questions ahead of time, and one of the questions was, does dense make sense? Mm-hmm. And it really caused me to reflect on that. I had served on council at that point in time for already 4 years, and so I had some ideas about, as you say, good density and not so good density. And so I actually wrote a little poem, which I'll read to you. You can decide if you want to use it or not. It's a silly poem. I'm a really bad poet. I'm a guitar player, and I write lyrics for my songs. And my songs sound beautiful. My lyrics are stupid.
Oh, well, you know what I think we ought to do? We ought to go get your guitar.
We should. I live a few blocks away.
I'll sing it. I'll sing it, and you play the guitar.
That's fine. And so this one I have not put to music, but I in preparation for that candidate forum in 2019, I wrote a poem called "Does Dense Make Sense?" And so when I got asked the question, I said, I have, and I wrote
I'm ready, bring it.
And it's really a silly poem, but it actually is as silly as the poem is, and it's kind of Dr. Seussy rhymes, but it really does reflect, and I will pull it up and read it for you. It does reflect my view on density, which is sometimes density does make sense. And as you say, there's good density, and there's not so good density. And I think there's a natural tension here between people don't like change, right?
Yeah.
We're human beings, right? And
totally.
we get comfortable in our environment. And then when somebody comes along, especially it's an external force, and says, "Hey, listen, I'm going to change your world," unless you can convince me you're going to change it for the better, and people, we're human beings. We tend to be selfish, right? We tend to be self-interested. That's just the way we're hardwired, and so it takes a lot of effort to, and I'm not saying that people who don't want change in the neighborhood are selfish. I'm not implying that, but I'm just saying that as human beings, we often are resistant to change. We're concerned about things that might potentially impact our well-being, and that's a natural human instinct. And so I think as policymakers, it's up to us to figure out ways where we can ensure that Boulder is welcoming and inclusive to people who want to live here, but doing it in such a way that that either doesn't impact people who live here, or it does impact them, but it impacts them in a way that they are comfortable with, that they say, okay, I get that, I understand that. And I'll give you a concrete example. Boulder has allowed ADUs, accessory dwelling units, since I think the 1980s. But we had these Byzantine rules up until 2018 that basically made it impossible to have ADUs. ADUs are accessory dwelling units, and there's two types of ADUs. One is within the house. In other words, you could take your house and you could turn the basement or your attic or part of the house into an accessory dwelling unit. What makes an accessory dwelling unit? Typically it's two things. A separate entrance so that the principal owner doesn't have somebody walking through their living room or bedroom. And the second is usually kitchen. Those are the two things that make an accessory dwelling unit. Now some people want an accessory dwelling unit simply for another family member. Maybe they have an aging parent, right, who can't live on their own. Or maybe they have kids who haven't quite launched, right? But the classic, kids living in the basement. Well, kids living in the basement with a separate entrance so they could come and go, and maybe kitchens so they could cook their own stuff. So about half of our ADUs are actually used in exactly those situations, either home offices or for family members. They're not rented, they're just spaces for people to be. The other half of our ADUs are in fact rented out. And the nice thing about accessory dwelling units is they don't require a whole lot of new construction or changes. The lot is still the lot, and the neighborhood still has the same character. You have to deal with maybe issues around parking,
more cars,
or cars if you have an external tenant. And so what we did in 2018, we realized that ADUs had a lot of potential. By the way, there's a second type of ADU. So I talked about the ones that are within a house. We have what's called detached ADUs, which is somebody builds a little tiny house in their backyard. It's a separate thing. Maybe maybe they have a detached garage and they put something over the garage, like a carriage house type thing, or they put a tiny house in their backyard, attached, detached. But in 2018, when I was on council, we realized that the ADUs simply weren't working because our rules were just so restrictive going back to the 1980s. And so we significantly liberalized the rules. It was a hard-fought discussion because we had people who came to council and said, oh my God, you're going to ruin our neighborhood, right? You're going to
obviously
bring a bunch of renters into our neighborhood. Where the car's going to go, there's going to be noise, there's going to be all sorts of issues. And there's a tension between representation and leadership. When you're in this position, when you're an elected official, part of your job is to listen to the community and represent their views. The majority wants to do, if 12 people walk in the door and want to do one thing and nobody's on the other side, I'm probably going to do what those 12 people want, unless I think it's just crazy. On the other hand, as an elected official, you also have a duty of leadership. And sometimes that means the majority doesn't prevail. If majority always ruled in this country, we wouldn't have human rights, we wouldn't have civil rights, we would trample on the human and civil rights of the minority, and that's not our tradition in America, or at least hasn't been our tradition recently. And so bringing that to the micro level, to the city level, sometimes that means when you serve on city council, you make decisions that maybe the majority of the community is not super comfortable with. It doesn't mean that we know better than anybody else or that we're trying to be arrogant about it, but sometimes our job is to represent the entire community, not just a parochial interest.
One way to think about that is the 60,000 in-commuters that you mentioned earlier are very politically weak. They don't really have a seat at the table. Do we care about them, or do we? Kind of like
perfect example. They're not voters by definition. They're not voters. They don't live in Boulder, and so so we need to look at the 60,000 in-commuters. We need to look at students who often don't have a seat at the table. We need to look at people who are just not engaged in our community. We have minority communities who unfortunately have a lower track record for voting, and so they don't have a seat at the table. And so we can talk about ways to increase participation, but as elected officials, we do have a duty to those people, whether they're at the table or not. We're their voice at the table, and we also try to take a longer term view of things, because oftentimes, again, human interests, oftentimes people are self-interested, parochial, they tend to have short-term views, and I think we try to encourage people to look out a little bit longer. What are things going to look like in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 50 years from now, and what kind of city do we want to be ultimately? I believe that Boulder's best days are ahead of it. I think you can be backward-looking or forward-looking, and while we have a wonderful town, the built community is fantastic. Of course, we have this beautiful environment that we're blessed to have, but I also think that we have the potential to be better than we are right now, to scaffold, to build onto what we already have. And I think that's where elected officials come in. I think it's our job to lead in addition to representing. And those aren't mutually exclusive. Sometimes they bump into each other. So ADUs is a good example. I'll get back to ADUs. And so in 2018, those of us who were on council wanted to liberalize or expand our ADU rules, because they made it very difficult for people to create ADUs. And we got a lot of community pushback on that. And this is where leadership comes in, where you have to say, I hear what you have to say. I understand it. I think the horrible things you're worried about are probably not going to happen. You're going to have to trust me with this. And people were not, super keen on trusting, but we pushed it through, and there was a majority of us on council who said, just give us a shot here. And we actually, in 2018, didn't go as far as we would have liked to have gone. And so we kind of pulled it back a little bit.
Is that because staff was pushing back on you?
No, it was because of the community. It was, if we wanted to do this, and the community wanted us to do this, we kind of did it in between. We said, okay, we'll do some of the things that we think are most impactful, but we won't do all of those things because we're here in your community. We understand your concerns. We actually don't think those horrible things you're concerned about will actually happen, but we'll do a few of these things, and then we'll come back in 3 or 4 or 5 years and see how things went. So we did that in 2018. The horrible things didn't happen.
It passed. We got a nice bump in the number of ADUs.
Phenomenal bump in the number of ADUs. And the other thing we did, and this gets to housing affordability, is we actually created 2 types of ADUs.
Yeah.
One type of ADU that anyone could create by right in their home or in their yard. It had limitations as far as size, and they're all owner occupied, right? This is not for absentee landlord. This is the owner still has to live in the principal residence, and they could use it either for home office, for family members, or to rent out. And they had to be certain sizes and other restrictions that they had to do with safety, and they had to provide parking, off-street parking. But we also created a separate type of ADU, and we call it affordable ADU.
Yeah, affordable designated.
Exactly.
Covenant.
And what we said there is, we said, okay, we'll do a deal with somebody if they want to do a deal with us. And what we'll give them is larger ADU size. We'll waive the off-street parking requirement, and we gave them some other benefits. But in exchange for that, they had to agree that if they rented that ADU out, they would make the rent at or below that affordable by somebody who makes 75% of the area median income. So somebody that's kind of middle class or lower middle class could afford to live in that ADU. And so if they committed to that, and we check it, I mean, it's a covenant, it's recorded and all that stuff. It's not just a soft promise, it's a hard promise. If they agreed to make that ADU affordable to people at or below the 75% of the area median income, then they could make a bigger size, they could waive the parking and so on and so forth. We had no idea in 2018 if that was going to work. We thought we could get crickets. No one could go for that. So then fast forward to 2023. Half of the several hundred ADUs that have been created since 2018 have been affordable.
Awesome.
Half of them, and it was a success.
So in one sense, that's great. I do want to push back on that in the following way, and that is, I asked Jay Sugnet about the affordability of all of the units, and he was like, I think like 95% of them, even the market rate ones, are affordable by the definition. Today,
that's true.
There's no guarantee. Like these are guaranteed and these are not.
Yeah.
But I think it's notable that almost all ADUs are affordable according to the metric
because of their size. Yeah, absolutely right. And Jay's right.
That's a good point.
Because Jay's right, because most of these things are 500, 600, 800 square feet, right? So you can only charge so much in rent, right? If you got a one-bedroom, 800 square foot apartment,
interesting
you can only charge so much in rent. But the law of housing costs is like the opposite of the law of gravity. The law of gravity is everything goes down. The law of housing costs is everything goes up. Everything will always go up, right? Because we have a scarcity. And we've created that scarcity here in Boulder, which is a topic we can talk about if you want to. Intentionally or unintentionally, we've created a scarcity of housing because we've created a scarcity of land here. And so our housing costs, whether they're rental costs or purchase costs, will continue to go up. And
scarcity of land plus extremely inefficient land use.
We could talk about that too. We could talk about that too. And so, while Jay is right that 75% affordability covenant may not be necessary in all cases now, because some of the market rate stuff is just market rate inexpensive. I think you're going to start to see a separation between the market rate stuff and the 75% stuff. And by the way, why would somebody agree to that 75% covenant if they didn't know that the benefits were outweighed? Now, some people, simply because of the configuration of their home, can't provide parking, so they're kind of forced into that 75%. They say, listen, I really don't want to charge it at 75% AMI, but I don't have a place to put anybody to park, so I'm just going to go ahead and do it. And by the way, it's not that much lower than market rate now anyway. And that may be fine for now, but I think over time we're going to see a differentiation between the affordable ADUs and the non-affordable ADUs. It's just an example of
I do want to raise that, because it would be great if we could figure out some naturally occurring market rate affordable housing.
Sure.
So and that's really dwindling. Like, I think single family homes has gone to zero from 30% 20 years ago. We do have mobile homes, manufactured home, which is a source of naturally occurring affordability. ADUs is another example. And then there is some extent, if you're like single or a couple, there is some affordable market rate apartments that you can.
So let's talk about some of the tools that we have available to us to create market rate affordability. Go ahead.
I do want to talk about this. This is very, very interesting. But can we circle, kind of tie the knot on ADUs and what happened in this year with that?
Yeah, sure. So in 2023, we looked back. We said, okay, 5 years ago, we liberalized the rules on ADUs. We didn't go quite as far as we would have liked to have gone because there was some community pushback. And so we checked in 2023, and the horrible things that people were concerned about didn't happen. And so we further liberalized the rules in 2023. And we can talk about the specifics, but we kind of did the second half of what we wanted to do in 2018 and 2023, and there was no community pushback. In other words, people were concerned, and I get the fact that people, much less. And I get the fact that people don't like change, number one, and people are scared of uncertainty or the things they don't know, right? And I get that. That's human nature. And so there was this concern about the unknown in 2018. And once we lived through 5 years of ADUs, we realized that they were acceptable, that they weren't destroying neighborhoods, that they did provide great housing affordability, either at market rate or at covenanted lower rates. They provided great opportunities for seniors aging in place, for rental income for people who maybe wanted to rent out part of their home, for young people who have not quite launched, they can live in their parents' homes. And so it created lots for home offices. COVID was a big impact on where people worked, right? And it continues to be to this day. And so people said, geez, I'm going to set up a part of my house that's separate enough so that I can have my work and my home. But I don't have to commute very far. I can commute in my slippers, right? Across the hall. And so I think, so in 2023, we further liberalized the rules. We did the things in 2023 that we didn't have the courage to do in 2018. And I think we'll continue to look at ADUs. I don't think we're done there.
Okay, I was going to ask you, and I assume you voted for the ordinance change.
I did, yeah. One of the things that, for example, that we did not do in 2018 that we then did do in 2023 is we had a saturation limit. In other words, we said in 2018, because there was a lot of pushback from people in the community, that all right, there's not going to be more than X number of ADUs within a certain radius, right? And there's a mathematical formula, and so it became a first come first serve. It became a bit of a race because so if your neighbor to your left and your neighbor to your right both put in ADUs, you were screwed. You could.
And it's also very opaque because you didn't know. There was no website where you could just plug in your address.
So you had to actually. So if you thought you wanted to do an ADU, the first thing you had to do is you had to call up city staff and say, are we at the saturation limit in my neighborhood, right? And it was hard for them to calculate too, because it's radius and it was very complicated. And then you might be disappointed. You might find out, oh no, your neighbors beat you to the punch, and so now you can't even do an ADU.
Yeah.
And we realized after 5 years of experience, these things were not neighborhood impacting.
Yeah.
And so we said, let's just get rid of the saturation limit.
At least not in a negative way. I assume they have positive impact on neighborhoods.
I think they do have positive impact. I think that we have several hundred people now who live in Boulder in ADUs that didn't live here before. I don't know if they lived here before, but they may not have been able to afford to live here before. So we got rid of the saturation limit, and the wheels haven't fallen off. We got through it. So that's one example of something that we did in 2023 that we didn't do in 2018. I think we'll continue to look at ADUs. We're talking now about duplexes and triplexes. We can talk about that if you'd like. We can talk about occupancy if you like. There's lots of tools in our toolkit where we can increase housing opportunities. I don't like to say increase density, although I suppose mathematically that's true, but it's really increasing housing opportunities without having a significant impact on, first of all, little or no construction, right? It's not like we're tearing down houses and building apartment buildings. Little or no construction impacts, and just using the existing infrastructure to allow people to live in our community.
Well, now my brain's going in two directions because, the notion of using the housing that we have through occupancy reform is, to me, is also a no-brainer. I love the ADUs. Something that I didn't tell you about when we were talking earlier is I'm on the Housing Advisory Board.
And so I knew that.
So I became an expert on ADUs. At least I learned as much as I could, so I could weigh in on that stuff. And that was just a really interesting process and really satisfying. There was a lot of community input, and Housing Advisory Board got a lot of input from various people, and then we sat and deliberated, talked with city staff, and then handed it off to you guys, and then you guys passed the ordinance, and I was like, man,
it was easy.
This is easy. Politics is easy.
Well, sometimes it's easy, sometimes it's not. We're gonna come up on a tough discussion here in a few weeks. This is you and I are recording this on July 15th. And I don't know when people will view this, but
in a week or so.
In mid-August of 2023, and some people will see this after the vote has happened. We'll be taking up occupancy, and that's a little like co-ops or ADUs were when we dealt with them in 2017, 2018. Occupancy is going to be a tough discussion. We have people in the community who would not like to see an occupancy limit. Just let me set the stage. Currently, Boulder's occupancy laws, which date back many decades, limit the number of unrelated people. If you're, listen, I'm one of 7 kids. There was 9 people lived in my house. There was no rules about that. So if you're related, you can do whatever you want.
My wife and I have a blended family. So
okay, there you go.
We have a number of people in our house.
Right. But for unrelated people, and this to be candid about that, this is aimed at students, right? This has to do with students, because we usually see high occupancy in areas that are adjacent to the university, right? Students oftentimes don't have a lot of money. We were all students at one point in time. We didn't have a lot of money, and so students will often double up and triple up in arrangements so they can reduce their rent costs. It's not exclusively students, but that's probably the majority of it. So Boulder, like a lot of college towns, has an occupancy limit. It's 3 people in certain zoning districts and 4 people in other zoning districts. And actually, where most of the rentals are, like 2/3 of the rentals are, it's actually 4. So I like to think of it as really more 4 than 3. It is 3 in some areas, but there's not a lot of rentals in those areas, and so it's not, and they're not super university adjacent, so it doesn't really affect those that much. So I really think of it as 4. The proposition that's on the table right now that council will be voting on in a few weeks, in August of 2023, is to increase that number from 4 to 5. There's a lot of concern, especially in the areas near the university, about how that will impact them. And there's 2 types of impacts that I hear about from the community. One is just more people, which means more cars, more noise, more those types of social impacts. And the second is the impact on home values, and we've seen a large number over the last 2 decades of homes, especially on University Hill, but maybe in Martin Acres as well, that had traditionally been single-family homes where families would live, where because of occupancy and rents going up, those properties become very attractive to an outside investor who says, hey, listen, I'm going to buy this house from this family that maybe is otherwise going to move on, and I'm going to turn it into a rental unit for 4 or 5 or more students who are going to the university, and I can do the math on it. If I can get X dollars per person for this house, I'll pay this family top dollar for that house and convert that into a rental unit. And there's nothing wrong with that on a case by case basis, and it happens all the time. But when you do it on a macro basis throughout a neighborhood, you get a shift in the neighborhood, from maybe a blend between families and students to more student heavy. And there are families in some of those neighborhoods that are concerned about that turnover, that change in the character of their neighborhoods. Maybe it's a good change, maybe it's not a good change, but they're concerned about that change.
Yeah, one of my arguments against that is like, when you think about how housing has been constrained over the decades from the 50s to now, one of the arguments for any kind of change has always been this negative change might impact our housing values, you know. So it's always been like we're trying to protect our home values.
Right.
And now that argument doesn't hold water, because like you said at the beginning, we kind of know that housing prices are going to keep going up, and you can't argue that a gas station next to your house. I mean, I guess there's specific places where you could make specific properties less valuable, but generally speaking, you could do a lot of negative things to your neighborhood without making housing prices go down. It would be really like you'd have to really mess up a city council to make prices go down. But like, so now that argument doesn't hold water, you kind of like, well, we still don't want higher occupancy, so we'll argue that prices will go up. And so now it's like all the arguments against more housing are like prices it's going to be exacerbate affordability. So it's I mean, to me it just feels like it's like I'm not comfortable with the
and I get the point that you're making about inconsistency. You have different people making different arguments, right? You know,
course,
and so person A may say
that doesn't make it not a valid argument.
It does make it not a valid argument, and person A may say I don't like it because of this, and person B may say, well, I don't like it because of this, and those reasons are not consistent with each other, but they don't have to be consistent with it. People can have their own reasons for things, and some people it's just cause I don't want.
Can I ask another very specific question? So I know there's been a lot of pushback on the Hill and Martin Acres about increasing occupancy, and to me that suggests, like, I think their complaints would make a lot more sense to me if there was evidence that there was a lot of empty bedrooms in those neighborhoods, that if occupancy was reformed, that all of a sudden those empty bedrooms would start being used, and that would cause negative externalities. Is there something wrong in my argument?
No, I don't. Unfortunately, I don't have data. Maybe city staff does. I haven't seen it yet. If they do, about that, I mean, I have to assume there's empty bedrooms. In my house, I mean, that's a good example. We raised 2 kids in our house, and our kids have left.
But you're not on the Hill, though.
I know I'm on the Hill, but my point is, I have to believe there's lots of empty bedrooms around town, and including I'm sure on the Hill. I'm sure there's houses that have extra bedrooms. My default
assumption is highly unlikely that there's a lot of empty bedrooms.
There may not be. There may not be. I simply don't know. This is. I don't know. My prediction is, and some people will watch this video after the council vote happens, so we'll see if my prediction turns out to be right. My prediction is that the majority on council will, in fact, increase occupancy from current level, which is roughly 4 to 5. That's my prediction. Is that going to be horrible? I don't know. I really don't know. I don't know what impact
You're not confident enough to vote for that.
Well, I'll talk about my position in a second, but what will happen, regardless of what my vote is, if the majority on council does, in fact, increase occupancy to 5, what will happen? The answer is I don't know. I mean, are there extra bedrooms even to do that, or are most of these houses already illegally overoccupied anyway? So if a landlord's renting to 5 people and suddenly he's gone from an illegal situation to a legal situation, there's not more people there, right? It's still 5. It's just he's now just out of the hot water. And so and the city, to be candid about this, and the city staff is very transparent about it. City staff is not super aggressive in enforcing occupancy, right? First of all, it's complaint based. The city doesn't go around and do bed checks and knock on doors and say how many people sleep in here. So that's number one. It's complaint based. A lot of neighbors, as long as their neighbors who are in highly occupied places are being good neighbors, they leave them alone.
Is not comforting to me at all.
I know. I'm just telling the reality. I'm not saying that this is a good thing. I'm just saying the fact of the matter is that it's complaint based. And so the city staff doesn't even do anything unless they hear a complaint. They do hear a complaint, they go out to the house and they ask the question, how many people are living here? Unrelated people are living here. The person answering the door, maybe they'll give an honest answer, maybe they won't get an honest answer, okay? and the staff is pretty much going to trust them. They're not going to go around and interview everybody in the house and do a bed check and find
Well,
out
I've
who's
heard
related.
rumors about counting toothbrushes in
I've heard
bathrooms. Is that a thing?
I've heard rumors of that too. I kind of doubt it. I know our city staff.
That seems crazy to me.
Yeah, they have more important things to do than count
Yeah.
toothbrushes. And even if there is a determination, maybe the person who answers the door is honest and says, yeah, there's 6 people living here, or they count toothbrushes or whatever they do. Even in those situations, the city staff says, okay, here's the deal. Technically, you're overoccupied. We would like you to get down to the occupancy limit. What's the term of your lease? Oftentimes people have 12-month leases as pretty standard, and oftentimes people, especially students, will run on a midsummer to midsummer lease, and the staff will say, okay, you're overoccupied. We're not going to kick anybody out. We're not going to make anybody homeless, but we would ask that by the time your lease renews, you get down to at or below the occupancy limit. And that's the enforcement, okay? Now, some people would like it to be more tough enforcement. Some people think it should be more lax enforcement.
Yeah.
That's what city staff does right now, is it's complaint-based, and it's not evicting people, it's asking people to get to the occupancy limit, whatever that happens to be, by the time their lease renews the next year.
Yeah, I mean, I think in a perfect world we have better laws than that, where city staff doesn't say, oh, like we're going to sort of arbitrarily relax our enforcement. Yeah,
but that's just the reality. I mean, they have a ton of city staff. We've got.
Well, I'm just saying. My point is that it's unfair to city staff and to the residents who.
I'm sure it's not their favorite thing to do.
May or may not get evicted, and may or may not have to,
No, I understand.
Change,
I understand. Listen, I understand the uncertainty it creates for the residents, right?
Yeah.
If you're in an I remember going door to door when I first ran for council in 2015, and I knocked on one door, just didn't know who was living there, and a young woman answers the door, and she was very nice. We had a good conversation, and she goes, "Well, what's your position on occupancy?" And this was 2015, so I was just starting to run. So I didn't even have much of a view on it. And I said, "Well, I don't know." And she goes, "Well, I just want to let you know that in this house, there's 6 women living in this house, and technically we're overoccupied. And I hope you wouldn't report us." And I said, "Well, of course I'm not going to report you." It wasn't even my neighborhood. It's like it didn't impact me at all. I'm having a nice conversation with her. But she did, she taught me a little bit. She says, "Listen, we live in fear. We live in fear because there's 6 of us living in this house. We think we're good neighbors, but we're technically violating the law." And that was impactful to me. I thought, well, gosh, we don't want anyone living in fear by any means, regardless of what the city's enforcement is. And so the question is, well, how do we strike that balance between creating housing opportunities for those who are willing to live, in a kind of collective or cooperative fashion, but not impacting the neighborhoods. And one of the things that we've done, this council has done, is we've looked more downstream at the impacts. In other words, rather than assuming that more people living in a house will have bigger impacts on parking, on trash, on noise, right?
Yeah.
Maybe that's true, maybe that's not. The woman I spoke to, I talked to her neighbors because I was going door to door. They all love them. There's 6 quiet women living in the house. They were having no impact in the neighborhood, right?
Yeah.
Some houses.
You might say they were having positive impact.
Positive impact. There are certainly houses, whether they have 5 people live in them or 3 people live in them, that have negative impacts because they're not respectful neighbors. And so, there's not necessarily a correlation between number of residents and their impact. There can be, obviously. Parking is probably one that's roughly correlated. Although you can have like a family like mine. I mean, there was 9 people, there were 7 kids in my family. At one point in time, there's 5 teenagers. We had a lot of cars, but there's no law that says you can't have a lot of kids. And so one of the things that this council has done, even before,
there's a law that says you can't have a lot of roommates.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, it's kind of ironic, right? Because large families is not really in vogue. I mean, when we kind of think about
I get the inequity.
carbon footprint and environmental impact.
I get the inequity. I understand that. So what we before we even have tackled occupancy, the city council, is we've tackled the impacts, or at least the ostensible impacts, of disrespectful neighbors, whether they're highly occupied or they're just disrespectful.
Yeah.
And so we have so far there's the 3 biggies, which is noise, trash, and parking. And we've tackled 2 of them already, and we're working on parking right now. And so we adopted earlier this year in 2023 new noise ordinance and new trash noxious weed ordinance to really make it easier for people to enforce that, because no one wants, regardless of how many people are living in the house next to you, no one wants a lot of noise at 3 o'clock in the morning, right? No one wants that.
No.
And so you have to be a respectful neighbor, and it would, in a perfect world, we wouldn't have laws about this. People would just be naturally respectful, but some people aren't, right? And so we revised our noise ordinance so that it was easier for our code enforcement people to enforce it, to kind of tell people, dial it down. Same thing with trash and noxious weeds, to say, hey, listen, it's your responsibility to mow your lawn. It's your responsibility to put your trash in a safe way that doesn't attract a lot of bears and other animals.
Can I raise an issue
please.
that's kind of adjacent to this?
Yeah.
One of the things that concerns me about increased density or having 4 students or 5 students living next to me is pot smoke. Like, I'm not a pot smoker,
Right.
and I don't really want to smell that.
Right.
My kids at their mom's house, they have a neighbor who's adjacent, and they smell lots of
Yeah,
pot in their house.
Yeah.
And has there been any noise about smell?
There was actually, when I first got on council in 2015, there was actually a fair amount of noise around smell. Back in 2016-17, it was less about people casually consuming next door and more about some of the grow operations that were having smell drift into the neighborhood. And so we actually changed some of the rules around that. It hasn't come up much in the last few years. It actually is going to come up soon, and probably after you post this the video. We're taking on July 20th, which is just a few days after this is being recorded, a hospitality bill. So the state law changed a few years ago and allows cities on a city-by-city basis to decide whether or not people, an institution, a restaurant or a bar, could allow on-site consumption of cannabis. And obviously, if people are ingesting gummies, no impact at all, as long as they don't drive or do something stupid.
No smell impact.
No smell impact.
Like high garlic concentration.
Right, exactly. But obviously, if people are smoking, there is an environmental impact, and there may be some health impacts too. That's a separate issue, and on the consumer. And the question is, should we allow weed to be smoked in an institution no different than people go and buy a beer at a bar, right, or at a restaurant? And that's something that we're going to take on and try to strike a balance between the maybe the needs or desires or rights of people who want to consume. They don't want to consume in their home for various reasons, or they just want the social atmosphere, just like we'd like to go to bars, to be able to go to a pot bar and be able to smoke there and try different things and do it in a social setting. But
smokers are people too.
Smokers are people too.
And I'm not really trying to
but do it in such a way that recognizes that there are environmental impacts and there are secondhand smoke impacts on people. And so we're going to try to thread that needle a little bit and try to figure out if there's a way we can allow things, because I'm not a consumer either of cannabis, but my going-in assumption is that cannabis really should not be treated any different than alcohol, right?
Yeah.
It's an intoxicating substance. We shouldn't let kids have it. We shouldn't let people drive, after they've consumed.
Yeah.
But the rules shouldn't really be much tougher than alcohol in my mind.
Yeah.
When it gets to smoking, you do have, because when I drink a beer, I'm not affecting anybody. As long as I don't get in a car, I'm not affecting anybody.
Yeah, right.
If I toke up, then somebody who's a few feet away has to smell that, right?
Yeah, right.
And so that I am having an impact. So it's a little different than consuming alcohol. And the question is, how do we do that in a way that where the smell? It's kind of funny because I don't smell. I walk around Boulder a lot. I don't smell a whole lot.
Yeah.
In New York City, which is going through the I go to New York a lot because my kids live there. New York City's going through that transition. They've got med. They're starting to adopt rec, and New York also, because they're so dense.
It's intensive. Yeah.
It's very intensive, and so you got a lot more people living in a smaller area. Plus, they often have no place to smoke, so they smoke outside, right?
Yeah.
They smoke in parks or on streets or whatever. And so in New York, I smell it everywhere. They've got a smell problem. I don't think Boulder has much of a smell problem.
Interesting. Well. Okay, so
we were talking about housing. Let's get back to housing.
We started lots of threads. Yeah, but mostly we end up talking about housing on this podcast. But I want to circle back to your opposition to the current ordinance that's being proposed that may get passed in August. maybe just explain what your
Sure.
position is.
Well, it's less about opposition and more about the way it's being approached. I make the analogy, and you may or may not agree with the analogy, but I make the analogy to what we did on ADUs, where we created a type of ADU where, in exchange for permission to do a certain type of ADU, the landlord agreed to hold the rents down to a certain level. Okay, I would love to see something very similar in occupancy, where we trade off. We say, all right. Because remember, the city issues rental licenses. Actually, a lot of cities don't issue rental licenses. Boulder issues rental licenses, and that's for health and safety reasons. We want to make sure that there's egress and
Maintenance
and all sorts of stuff
Safety.
that safety of the tenants. And so we issue rental licenses.
Hey, Jim. Nice to see you. Great. I'm interviewing your neighbor Bob.
Yeah. We have the camera going.
You're not recording, are you?
We are recording. You're on it. And so we issue rental licenses for a whole lot of reasons, and so we have a little bit of, the city has a little bit of discretion, a little bit of power, quite frankly, over, for example, a few years ago we passed some tougher energy regulations around the environmental situation of housing. We couldn't do this for private homeowners because we don't have a whole lot of authority there. But because we do issue rental licenses, we said we're not going to renew your rental license until you get your rental property up to a situation as far as R factors and environment and efficiency and a whole bunch of rules they had to go through. We gave them several years to do that, but they had to meet what we called smart regs in order to continue the rental license. So we can use that rental license as a little bit of a leverage or a little bit of a tool to get landlords to do things. Now, rent control is not allowed in the state of Colorado as of the time of this recording. And maybe there was a bill this year, it didn't pass, maybe it'll pass in future years.
Year.
We can talk a little bit about that if you wanted to. But, so we as a city can't say to a landlord, you can't charge more than X. But what we can do is if we have a discretionary thing where we discretionarily grant them the right to rent a property, we can extract from them whatever deal we can extract. So that's why the ADU rule works, where we can say, we'll grant you an ADU license for a certain size ADU in exchange for which you agree that the rents will be at or below a certain level. We could do the same thing for occupancy, and I think it's going to be a missed opportunity if this council simply moves the number from effectively where it is right now at 4 to 5 unrelated people, and they just say, okay, fine, we'll cool with 5. First of all, I'm not sure. Back to your earlier point about how many empty bedrooms are there truly, to be filled up, and how many are already 5 occupied places are there already. All we just have done is legalized it as opposed to.
So I have an answer for you.
Yeah.
My estimation, I spent about a week looking into this
Oh,
question.
great, good.
My estimation in Boulder
Yeah.
is about 30,000 empty bedrooms.
Wow, citywide.
Citywide, yeah.
Now,
I don't know neighborhoods by neighborhood.
Yeah, it'd be more interesting.
And I can show you the blog that I wrote up.
That makes sense to me because there's roughly 46,000 dwelling units in Boulder, and a lot of those are apartments, right? So they're just one-bedroom apartments. So there's obviously not an empty bedroom there. But I think, I mean, don't hold me to this number, but I seem to recall there's about 20,000-ish single-family dwelling units, right, houses. So you're an estimate of 30,000.
I try to be conservative in the sense that if there was 2 bedrooms and 2 people, there's no empty bedroom.
Okay, that's conservative, that for sure. So I don't doubt your number. It's probably, if anything, on the low side.
I try to make a, be able to say that number with a straight face,
So let's just go down that path. I'll come back to what my idea is on occupancy in a second. So let's go back, let's say there's 30,000, okay? Mm-hmm. Now, a lot of those, I don't know if it's half or 2/3, are probably in neighborhoods that are not going to be particularly helpful, right? Like my neighborhood, we live in North Boulder right now. Yeah. There are certainly some students that live in this neighborhood, but not a ton, because it's a long ways from the university. You can't walk to it. You could bike to it for sure, but people like to be near the campus. And so there's probably a fair number of those 30,000 bedrooms that are just in places that, that are not going to be very attractive to people who are going to tend to.
Well, and also not attractive for prospective landlords, right?
Right.
Like there's a lot of people living in town that, 2 people who have aged in place. Yeah. They're not looking to rent out rooms in their house.
Well, and my wife and I are good examples. We have more we have empty bedrooms, right? Because we raised 2 kids and they're now living in New York City. And we could certainly rent out those bedrooms if we wanted to. We've made a personal decision not to, right? But we could. We certainly could rent out those bedrooms. We could create an ADU.
But wouldn't you want to more if you could only do it in an affordable way?
Well, yeah.
To me, it's kind of like weird. It's like, okay, so it's not like an affordability clause is going to make you want to do that even more.
No.
Not that.
No, it won't make you want to do it more. I get that
Yeah.
entirely, and so that's a good segue back into where I'd like to go. I think it's going to be a missed opportunity in my mind if this council, which I suspect it will do, simply raises the limit from a current level of roughly 4 to 5, and we just say, okay, 5 is good, and we just stop right there. Will there be more people living in those empty bedrooms? Oh, I'm sure there will be. I don't know if it's going to be hundreds more or thousands more. I really don't know. And it'll take time for that to
I've heard it argued both ways. In fact, I had a city council candidate that I interviewed 2 years ago who was like, this is going to barely make any difference in terms of housing. Why are we even talking about it?
Right.
To like, this is a major, and in another breath, it was like, this is a major power grab. You're going about this.
Right. So the answer is, I don't know. I don't know what impact it'll have. It'll certainly be more than 0, right? There'll be certainly more people who are able to live in a 5 occupant house
or a 5-bedroom house,
or whatever it is.
Yeah.
It's not going to be measured by bedrooms. It's going to be measured just by number. So there certainly it'll be more than 0. Is it going to be dozens, hundreds, or thousands? I have no idea at all. But here's what I would, in my perfect world, I would like to do. I would have liked to have done. I don't think I'm going to get a majority on council to support this. I would have liked to have tied that 5th occupant that increased from 4 to 5 to affordability. In other words, I would have liked to have said, okay, landlord, if you want to charge market rate, you can put 4 people in there. Yeah. Market rate, you can charge, knock yourself out, whatever you want to charge for 4 people. If you want to go to 5, we want to ensure affordability, and we're going to pick it based on area median income. Whether it's 60% of area median income or 75% or something like that. In other words, a rent cap. And rent control is not allowed in Colorado, but what is allowed in Colorado is a quid pro quo. Because the city has the discretionary right to hold, to issue or not issue rental licenses. What we could say to a landlord is, in exchange for allowing you to have 5 people, you have to agree to affordability at a certain level. And that because what this is all about, at the end of the day, the goal here, let's keep in mind the goal here. The goal is not to cram as many people into a house as possible. The goal is affordability, okay? Now, one could argue, well, geez, if there's more housing, supply and demand will cause rates to go down. Maybe that'll work and maybe it won't work.
On that. Like, I think about not just affordability, but also like our climate goals.
Yeah.
If an empty bedroom in your house
right.
starts being occupied,
right.
That's one less person that's commuting in from Erie.
Yep.
And I assume that you climate control all the rooms in your house.
Of course.
And so, in some sense, there's externalities associated with that.
Yep.
So, and then also like, I see this occupancy as one opportunity for naturally occurring affordability, and I like the affordable housing program in Boulder, but there is an aspect of it where it also can become a way to constrain housing too, for people that, because like again, we've gone from a lot of market rate affordability 20 years ago to 0, at least at the single family home.
So let's talk about that. Let's go right there. So what Boulder has done, we there's so many unintended, when government gets involved in intervenes and does things, invariably there are benefits from that because they're intended, and oftentimes there's unintended consequences. I'll give an example. We decided 60 or 70 years ago to go out and buy a bunch of open space. We have surrounded the city with 46,000 acres of open space.
Spent $1 billion.
So we spent a lot of money in open space, and voters have approved that every time. It's beautiful open space. I'm so glad we've preserved that for a whole lot of reasons. But that also makes our land available for housing scarce. Okay, so that was unintended consequence. Same with the 55-foot height limit. I think most people in town, it's in our charter. It's our Constitution that says no building can be taller than 55 feet. That's great, but that does have a consequence because now we can't build tall apartment buildings and have more people live here. Yeah. I'm not saying that we should change that. I'm just saying that's just a consequence. Whether it was intended or not intended, that was a consequence. So let's talk a little bit about...
you just have to add the third thing is our very expansive single-family zoning, which is very low density.
Low density, that was, again, decisions were made in the 50s and 60s and 70s. Yeah. That's even harder to change because at least with like the 55-foot height limit, I suppose I'm not going to advocate for this by any means, but I suppose if somebody was courageous, they could put on the ballot a change of that 55-foot height limit, and if 51% of the voters said yes, you could build tall buildings. It's going to be it would be very, very difficult to, the pie is so big, and the pie has been chunked up into all these little lots, right? It'd be very, very difficult to make the pie pieces smaller, right? I mean, I'm not saying it's impossible, but that would be a really, really just physically difficult thing to do. Now, there's things like lot splits and duplexes and triplexes, which we can talk about, where we can effectively create more housing units on the same lot, right? And that's just go back to your point about density, and we can talk about that if you want. But let me talk a little bit about where were we going? I've lost my train of thought here.
The umbrella topic is what are possible ways of having market rate affordability?
Yeah. Thank you. So what we did about before I got on council, what the city did about 20 years ago was we adopted an inclusionary housing policy, and there was a recognition that Boulder was. This is back in around 2000, 2002, was becoming, back then, horrifically expensive, and that by comparison it's way worse now, and that it was going to be, it was trending toward a place where low-income families simply couldn't live here, right? We were going to end up with middle class and upper class and no low-income families. And so Boulder, to its credit, was very progressive back then, created what we call an inclusionary housing law or program, where we required builders of new market rate housing to create housing in parallel with that for low-income families, right? And because rent control is not allowed in Colorado, we had to provide a safety valve for that. So we required them to provide, and the number was 20%. Now we recently increased it to 25%, but let's just use 20%. What we required them to do, the developer of housing, is to say, you need to have 20% of that housing. You're going to build 100 units. 20 units have to be permanently affordable, permanently deed-restricted affordable to families making at or below 60% of the area median income. Now, there's a federal program that dictates the 60%. So I know you know this, but I'm saying this for the benefit of your viewers.
Yeah, obviously.
And there's federal tax credits that tie into this. We didn't entirely make this up. And so you have to have 20% or 20 units out of 100 be permanently affordable to low-income families. And because we can't impose rent control in Colorado, at least not as of now, we had to provide a safety valve so that that developer of those 100 units could, instead of putting 20 units of low-income affordable housing on site, they could write a check, which was the equivalent of that, and then we could take that money and give it to a mission-driven organization like Boulder Housing Partners or Thistle or Habitat for Humanity, and they could go out and build low-income housing with these federal tax credits. And so our goal back in the early 2000s was, at that point in time, we estimated that about 3% of the housing units in Boulder were affordable to low-income families, low-income being at or below 60% of the area median income.
3%?
3%.
Okay, that's a lot lower than the number David Adamson gives me.
Yeah, well, I mean,
like
I can give you
so, yeah.
No, that back in 2000, 2002? Yeah. No, it was about 3%. I mean, maybe he has a different threshold than I'm using.
Yeah, that's true. There's lots of ways to slice the data.
But by that definition of low income, it was about 3%. Our goal back then, 20 years ago, was to get it from 3% to 10%. And using this inclusionary housing tool to do that, to require.
Wait, the 3% was designated affordable?
No, it was just
market.
It was market.
It was just looking at the stats.
It was just maybe some worn down apartment buildings or maybe some mobile home parks that were 3% of all. If you took all the housing stock.
And that was at 60% AMI.
60% AMI.
That seems hard to believe.
Well,
okay.
we can
I'm curious to go look at.
We'll look at the data. So the goal was to get it from 3% to 10%. How are we going to get there? Well, we're going to have to have government intervention. We're going to have the government's going to have to come in and pass some rules. So we did that. We adopted our inclusionary housing program, and through the program over the last 20 years, we've got it from 3% to right about 9% now. 9% of our housing stock now is permanently affordable to families at or below 60% of the area median income. As a matter of fact, our goal was 10%, and we didn't time bound that. We didn't say 10% by such and such. We just said 10% eventually. Well, here we are on the threshold of that 10%. Yay! Yes, we achieved that, and so we just moved the goalpost on ourselves. We just increased it from 10% to 15%. So now we want 15% of our housing stock to be permanently affordable to low-income families, and so now we have more work to do. Right? We created more work for ourselves. Yeah. That's all good. There's nothing wrong with that. Yeah. The problem with that is who pays that tax? It's effectively a tax. Yeah. If someone wants to build a 100-unit apartment building and they want to have it all be market rate and they don't want to do the permanently affordable on site because it's kind of a hassle to have to administer that and so on and so forth, he says, okay, I'll just write a check. So he writes a check, or she writes a check. Who's paying that? Yeah, it's the people who live in those 100 units, right? Whether they're rental or for sale, it squeezes effectively the middle income. And so we've started to address one problem, but we created another problem, right?
Yeah.
And so we've gone from a situation where we had very little low-income housing, and now we have quite a bit more, and we're going to create even more. And the rich people are taking care of themselves. Don't worry about them. And but what we've done, we've squeezed the middle, right? We've got now the middle where they're like, well, hold on a second here. I used to be able to buy a house in Boulder for, $500,000 or $600,000, and now the median is $1.6 million.
Yeah.
Do the math on what kind of income you'd need
Yeah.
to afford a mortgage on a $1.6 million house, and that's just the median. And so we've really hampered the middle class, and some of that was just the market because of our scarcity of our land, and some of it was, quite frankly, caused as an unintended consequence.
This is very personal for me because my landlord has made more money on the appreciation of her house than on the high rent we charge.
Sure,
She charges us
exactly.
for the
Of course he has. Of course he has. It's a great investment for him. So what do we do with that problem? So a few years ago, Sam Weaver and I got our heads together. We had a long bus ride, so we had a long philosophical conversation, and this came out of a bus ride in it must have been about 2017, and we brainstormed, and we then spent the next several months fine-tuning a middle-income down payment assistance program, and I want to talk a little bit about that. And this is not going to solve the middle-income housing crisis by any means. Okay,
Yeah.
There's nothing magically we can do to make that $1.6 million median house price go down to $1 million or 800,000 or whatever. There's nothing we can do about that. But one of the problems, it's many problems, but one of the problems that some middle-income families have, and when they're wanting to buy, oftentimes their first house because they don't have equity, is they're chasing that down payment, right? They're saying, okay, we're going to set it. You have some people, a family or whatever, who want to buy that house, and they're saving their money. They say, all right, we realize that we have to have probably a 15 or 20% down payment in order to get a mortgage and be able to buy this house. And so they save their money, and they put aside a little bit every month, and the house of their dreams costs X, and they say, okay, 20% of X is this number, and so that's how much we have to save, and at the current rate, it's going to take us X number of years to do it. The problem is that the goalpost keeps moving, right?
Yeah,
It just keeps going out because
even the 10% of the down payment, the 10% down payment, what you need grows faster than your savings.
Exactly, because the value of the house, their dream house is now, and so they save and save and save and save for several years, and all of a sudden that house is twice as much. So 10% or 20% of twice as much is twice as much. And so they can never get there. They can never even get to the down payment. Maybe they can afford the mortgage, but they can't get into the house because they can't afford the down payment because the bank wants to have them have some skin in the game. So, and I realize there's other problems on middle income. This is not going to solve all of our middle income housing problem, but it can address one of them. And so what Sam and I put together was a middle income down payment assistance program where we say, listen, let's identify people who want to buy a house. And it doesn't even have to be their first house. Maybe they moved here from a less expensive town, and they deal with Boulder's expense. So it's not limited to first-time home buyers. But the idea is let's help them with that down payment part of it. We can try to solve that part of the problem. And so the program we put together, and we took it to the voters actually a few years ago, because we didn't have to, but we wanted to because we wanted to make sure.
I voted against this, by the
okay,
way.
that's fine.
I'm not in favor.
Okay,
of
that's
this
fine.
program.
That's fine. But I'll still talk about it anyway. I'll still talk about it anyway. Maybe you'll be the beneficiary someday. We'll see. You'll change your tune.
Yeah, I may actually benefit from it.
Yeah, exactly. So the idea, so we took it to the voters, and the voters approved it overwhelmingly. And then COVID happened, so it didn't get launched as quickly as we would have liked. But it's getting launched right now in 2023. And the program, I'll just very quickly describe it. It provides the down payment. I think we have a small contribution by the purchaser because we want to have them a little skin in the game. I can't remember, we settled it at 3% or something like that, a very small down payment. The city would loan the rest of the down payment, up to 20%, or 15 or 20%, I can't remember where we ended up. And it would be an interest-free loan. So you're not going to interest-free, and you don't have to pay it back right away, right? It's no debt service. All you have to do is qualify for that 80% mortgage. That's on you. Mm-hmm. That's on you to work with a bank to have enough income to qualify for the 80% mortgage. We'll cover most of the rest of it, okay? And we'll loan it to you. The city will take a security interest in your house because we have to protect, the taxpayers. So we'll take a second mortgage, right? We'll take a second. I'm below the mortgage that you're servicing. No interest on it. It's not going to grow over time. You don't have to pay it off right away. And you don't even pay any of it at all. You just service the first mortgage. That house is presumably going to appreciate, and God willing, your income will go up over a period of time. At some point in time, you may decide, hey, listen, we can afford a bigger house. We want to move. We want to take the equity that we just earned in this house, and we want it to parlay that into the next house. Maybe your family is growing or whatever. And so that's the point where you pay off that city mortgage.
And
so
you sell it at market rate.
whatever.
Yeah.
Well, you sell it at market rate. The trade-off, there's a benefit here. Obviously, we're giving away taxpayer money,
right.
or at least loaning away taxpayer money. So there's got to be a trade-off here. And the trade-off is that we would cap appreciation. Okay. You still get appreciation. So we're not trying to deprive you. And the city's not going to share in your appreciation. The city doesn't get like
Oh, I thought that's where you were going. I couldn't remember what.
There's no shared appreciation in this. And so let's just use raw numbers. Let's say you buy $1 million property. I don't know if those exist anymore, but let's say you buy it's an easy number to work with.
Yeah.
$1 million property, and let's say the city loans you $150,000 for a 15% down payment, and you service the debt. Okay.
Yeah.
And let's say 10 years from now, you say, okay, we're ready to upgrade into another house. Okay. A couple things have happened. So you took out an $850,000 mortgage on that $1 million house. First of all, you've been paying that mortgage down, okay? And so now amortization, such on a 30-year mortgage, you're not going to pay out a lot in 10 years, but you may have paid down $100,000 of that debt. So now you owe, instead of $850,000, you owe $750,000.
Yeah.
Okay. What has happened to that $1 million property? Well, it's worth a lot more in 10
Yeah.
years, right? I mean, even modest appreciation is probably worth $1.5 million. Okay.
Yeah.
So now you got a house that's worth $1.5 million. You paid $1 million for it. It's worth $1.5 million. Your debt's gone from $850,000 to $750,000. Now you still owe the city the $150,000, but that's just sitting over here in the corner. So now let's do the math on your pro forma here. You've got a $1.5 million house, you sell it, you take the first $750,000 and you pay off your mortgage, your bank mortgage. You take $150,000, you pay back the city, thank you very much, okay? So that's $900,000. You have $600,000. You invested very, very little of your own money in this, and now you have a $600,000 appreciation gain. And the city doesn't take any of that. That's not the city's appreciation, okay? And you take that $600,000, you can now you can afford the down payment on the next house because you now have $600,000 in the bank. Right. It's a good deal.
If you can find a house that.
If you can find a house that, exactly. That's a different issue. So
it's very closely related.
I know it's closely related. I mean, it doesn't solve all problems, and we don't know how many people.
Okay, I'm a little lost. What does the city get for this?
The city gets an appreciation cap. Okay, so the city gets a cap on appreciation. So let's say the market rate appreciation is.
It might have gone 1.8 or something.
Yeah, I think the number the city staff finally came up to was 3.2%. Okay, so let's say the market appreciation is 5%. So if you had all the money in the world,
it slows down the
appreciation, and that does two things. Number one, it's a fairness thing because the city's loaning you money interest free for a while, so there should be a trade-off there. But more importantly, this is the important part of this. It has less to do about you, okay, and more to do about the fact that we're creating a cohort of houses in Boulder that are going to be below market, okay?
Yeah.
So let's say the market rate appreciation is 5 or 6%, which is roughly what Boulder's experienced. We would cap it at, I think, 3.2 is what the city came up with. And so that house is going to be artificially below market, okay? And so over the course of 10 years...
And who buys that house?
Anyone who wants to buy that house,
and then they can turn around and flip it? Or it's still...
It's always subject to that cap. That's a perpetual thing.
When they transfer that title over, there'll be a clause in there that says,
it's a deed restriction right on the deed, and always and forever until that house gets torn down. Okay. That house can only go up 3.2%. So is someone going to be able to buy a cheap house? Sure, they're going to be able to buy a cheap house.
So 20, 50, 100 years from now.
But they're going to be stuck with that appreciation cap. So some people are going to say, well, phooey on that. I don't want to do that. Our hope is, of course, is that the next buyer participates in the program as well, because they're already subject to appreciation cap, so they might as well participate in the program and get the free down payment. And so this is we don't know if this is going to work, right? The thing about
and you won't know for like 20, 40 years, perhaps.
Well, I mean, we'll know in the first few years whether they have takers, right? People may look at 3.2% and say, heck it, I'd like the 5% market appreciation. I'm not going to, free down payment's nice, but you know what?
So the thing I like about the program is I like that we're trying different things, and we need to try lots of different options. The thing I don't like about it, and one of the narratives from kind of a macroeconomic perspective, is we have all of these constraints on supply, and perversely we have these incentives for demand. We have the mortgage deduction, and we have various kinds of ways of increasing demand. When you sort of peel back different policies that we have, one question you should ask yourself is, are we increasing supply? And I don't think we really want to be in the business of decreasing demand, except to the extent that maybe as a society we should maybe want less house. Like we don't always need to be buying bigger houses, which increases demand. But so this is when I kind of stare at this as a armchair macroeconomic economist, is you're increasing demand, by making it easier for people to buy a house.
Potentially we're doing that. I think I'm looking at it from a micro standpoint because I want to help that family
Yeah,
get into a
exactly,
house.
yeah.
And if as an incidental benefit of that, I can also artificially hold down the price of some of the housing
Yeah.
in our community. Whether that's increasing demand or it's not changing supply. I grant you that. We're not.
Yeah.
Some of the other things we're talking about, we've talked about, like occupancy, or we've been talking about ADUs or duplexes. Those can increase supply. And it's not our intention to increase demand, but it is our intention to try to lower people's costs and using artificial means, right?
Yeah.
The government intervention means. This is on the eve of me running for mayor, and so I want to kind of tie it back to kind of a more philosophical point here. I hope you're getting a sense out of this conversation that we're having, and we can talk about any other topics you'd like. I try to be a creative person. I try to be go out there and say, gosh, what are our problems and how can we creatively solve them? And one of the best compliments anyone ever paid me was a guy said into a very crowded room, if you want something done, tell Bob Yates it can't be done. And I felt really good about that. And he was talking about this museum of Boulder that I helped create a few years ago, and everyone said we couldn't do it, and then we created it, and I think it's a wonderful thing. But I love challenges.
I don't think the gondola can be done.
Okay, there you go. Damn it, Philip, we're going to create a gondola. And so I love challenges. I love, and that's my leadership style, which is to identify a problem, get a group of people together who are way smarter than me, have them brainstorm on ways to solve that problem, settle on a solution, and then have the courage to go out there and lead that solution to completion, even if that faces opposition from a majority in the community. Because that's, again, going back to this tension between leadership and representation, I think that as leaders in the community and as elected officials, we do have an obligation to sometimes take people to a place that they don't yet know where they want to go. Okay, and I don't mean to be arrogant about that, but if we had no leadership in this country, we would go nowhere. We would have no civil rights. We'd have no human rights. We would not advance the country. And so I think leadership matters. I think that it's important to ensure that our elected officials are people that are not just rubber stamping whatever budget the city staff brings to us and just kind of go and hum along and we're living in a great town and so on and so forth. We always need to know that we can get better. Whether that's our environmental actions, our housing actions, on transportation, on funding for the arts. There's a whole bunch of stuff that we can do better than we're doing right now. And I think we need to elect people who have the courage to take us to the next level, to hear good ideas in the community and to implement those ideas all the way to completion. Some of them are going to be really foolish ideas that just fall flat and are dumb in retrospect. Wish we hadn't done it. Seemed like a good idea at the time, right? But others are going to be cool, innovative things that are going to take us to a new place. And that's really what I'm running about is I'm blessed with the opportunity to be able to spend my time doing this, right? All my time doing this. And I love my job on City Council. I've been on it for 8 years. It's the best job I've ever had. And I want to continue to do that. And I want to do it in a way where I can continue to lead the community, maybe even lead it in a slightly different way to its better future. Whether that's better housing opportunities or better protection of our environment or more equitable treatment of people who live here who are disparate incomes. There's a whole bunch of things that we don't do right. As good as Boulder is, we don't do quite right yet. And I want to be part of those solutions.
Well, one thing I wanted to say that I admire about your leadership style is the way you communicate through your newsletter. I know I have friends who are a little frustrated with your newsletter, but I really appreciate the way you step through and in very clear detail explain what you were thinking, and it's very informational, and so I really appreciate that also aspect of service that you do. And yeah, you have very good communication style. So
well, thank you. I appreciate that. I studied journalism in college, and I was the editor of our school newspaper. But I quickly realized that journalism doesn't pay that well, and I wanted a slightly different life than that. And so I ended up going to law school instead. But I have this frustrated journalist in me. And when I first got elected to City Council in 2015. I wanted to have an avenue, a vehicle to communicate to the community. Three things. One is, what are we thinking about doing? What are we looking down the road and saying, hey, listen, we're thinking about making this change or this change. And I wanted to give the community some advance warning of that and actually even lay out the pros and cons and say, what do you think about that? Do you think we should do this thing or not? So that's one. The second is, so that's prospective. Retrospectively, I need to be able to explain my votes. You know, I've made something like 4,000 or 5,000 or 6,000 votes in the 8 years I've been on council. I'm responsible for each one of those votes. Some of them I probably would have, in retrospect, would have done differently, right? We all make mistakes. But I need to be able to stand up in front of the community. They hired me to do a job, and they hired me to make decisions. And I need to be able to explain those decisions, any one of those decisions.
And to remember them, for that matter. I mean, it's a nice reference, I assume,
yeah.
for you to go
Oh, yeah,
back.
it is a good reference. Sometimes I go, it's called What Was I Thinking? And sometimes I get to the end of the month when I have to write up what was I thinking. I'm like, God, what was I thinking? What was the point there?
Well, I meant more like, you can actually go back 5 years and remember what you were
Yeah,
thinking,
I know.
which is
It
pretty cool.
ended up being a good archival source because I've been doing it for about 7 years. But the second, so there's three things. One is prospectively, what are we doing? And I publish my newsletter on the first Monday there every month. I have to set aside that day. I get hundreds of emails on that day because I'm front of mind, right? People are looking at the newsletter, and either there's something I've said in the newsletter that triggers them to write me, or I'm just front of mind. They say, hey, by the way, I have a pothole on my street. Can you get that fixed? So
Hey, I got your newsletter, by the way.
By the way, there's a lot of by the ways, and that's fine because that's engagement. That's what elected officials I think owe it. One of the nicest compliments anyone ever pays me is when somebody comes up to me and says, "Listen, I don't agree with all your positions, but I appreciate your transparency." And in my mind, that's what elected officials owe their constituents is transparency. I'm not going to make everybody happy. I have the opportunity. We meet on Thursday nights. I have the opportunity every Thursday night to piss off half the people in town, and that's if I'm lucky. I only piss off half the people.
Assuming the issue's bifurcated.
Yeah, I know. And then next Thursday I get a chance. It's a different group of people I piss off every week. And so by the end of the year, you're like, you have no friends, right? And so, but what I think is important is not so much that I'm aligned with one person or the other, but more that at least number one, I'm listening to people, okay, and I'm making decisions based upon their input. I may ultimately not agree with them, but at least I'm listening to them. And secondly, that I explain myself. Why did I vote that way? Why did I do what I did? Okay, and I think you can get a person who maybe fundamentally disagrees with your philosophy to a comfortable place if they know that at least they've been listened to and they understand the logic of your decisions. And so you say that some people don't like my newsletter. I hope they don't like my newsletter because
I think the controversy around your newsletter has to do with the way you obtain emails. I actually don't know anything about that. I've heard people complain about
that's fine.
how emails
we can talk about that. And anyone who subscribes to my newsletter changes their mind can unsubscribe. It's an easy thing.
Yeah,
there's no charge for it.
Yeah. Sorry to me.
Yeah, no, that's fine. That's fine. The third thing I do for the newsletter, in addition to what are we prospectively about to do, thinking about doing. Secondly, what have we done and why did we do it? And the third is I like to celebrate our community. I like to celebrate all of the great things that are happening in our community that have nothing to do with city government. Like, for example, right now, I'm preparing the August 2023 issue of the newsletter. I am writing about the history of the shelter. Our Boulder shelter for the homeless has existed since 1987. It's a fascinating history. It's been around for 34 years. And did I do the math right there? 36 years. And there are people who are still alive today who founded that shelter in the 80s, and it's evolved and it's changed over time. And so I want to lay out the history. I've written dozens and dozens of profiles of various nonprofits, Dairy Arts Center, Museum of Boulder, Chautauqua, talking about all the great things that are happening in our community, both on the human service side of things and social side of things, from arts and culture, and I want to celebrate that. And if I can drill into a particular organization and understand why it's doing and who it's serving, and then share that with the rest of the community, I think it's a service as a quasi-journalist that I can provide. And I've got 7,500 people who subscribe to my newsletter, so I have a captive audience. So I can put that out there for them as well.
No, they're not captive, is what the point you made a minute ago.
Yeah, they're not captive. They can leave anytime they want. I don't charge for it. They don't want it. They just unsubscribe, whatever. We can talk about how. I think it is our duty as we get about 18,000 emails a year from constituents. Yeah. And that's a lot. If you do the math, that's a lot of emails. And I try to respond. I read all of them. Every single one of them I read. And I respond to, I wish I could say I respond to 100% of them. Some of them I don't respond to because some of them are, they come from out of town and they sent it to the wrong person, or it's just something I can't help them with. Or they've gone to the wrong place. But, I probably respond to an excess of 90% of my emails. And sometimes it's just showing empathy because somebody's hurting about something. Yeah. Sometimes I can help them. Sometimes I can connect them to the right person on city staff. Sometimes they're looking for information. Sometimes they don't know how to get something done. Sometimes they're advocating for us to do something or not do something, okay? And so if I can provide empathy, if I can provide information, if I can provide hope, those are the things that are the elements of, because if someone has taken the time to write to City Council or to write to me personally, I owe it to them to give them a response, even if it's just an acknowledgement. But I hope it's often more than that.
Well, I'm sorry we don't pay you a livable wage.
That's okay.
For,
I don't need it.
It's not okay. I
Well,
really feel strongly.
Well, let's talk about. I do feel strong. I agree with you. I actually completely agree with you on that. I don't need the money, but I feel strongly about that, and I have tried through the years to try to get the council wage increase. And the reason for that is not for anybody who's serving on council right now. The reason for that is because we only pay $12,000 a year. We don't, the people who are on council now, as much as I love each and every one of them, we don't necessarily represent the entire Boulder community, right? Because there are
a lot of homeowners, for example.
Yeah, there's $12,000 a year, there's only certain people who can put in the 30, 40, 50 hours a week that a council job requires, right? Yeah. We have people with kids, we have people with jobs, we have people who have second jobs. And so to say to people, hey, listen, serve the community on City Council
in the way you just described,
in the way that's necessary. You know, people come to me and say, well, geez, what's the minimum amount of time? You know, those of us who are retired can spend a little bit more time, but what's the minimum amount of time? And I tell people it's probably a minimum to do the job. It's probably about 20 or 30 hours a week. Yeah. And $12,000 an hour, that's not even minimum wage.
No, that's someone should sue the city for
well, actually, believe it or not, there's actually a clause in the Colorado statutes. There's a minimum wage statute, and there's a little exception. One of the exceptions is elected official.
Oh my gosh.
So we have no claim. We have no claim for minimum
terrible.
wage. It is terrible. But all kidding aside, though, what's terrible about it is there are people in our community who could make a contribution, but who simply can't afford to give up that. I love to wave a magic wand and make 30 hours a week, 3 hours a week, but we have a demanding community, and that's just what the job takes. Okay, and that's fine. That's a problem we've imposed upon ourselves. And so if we say, geez, okay, we can't lower the time commitment, but we could do is pay a living. Fort Collins just did this, by the way. Fort Collins just went to their voters. They were paying about the same thing, about $10,000 or $12,000 a year, and they said, well, geez, it's taken a lot of time. We have certain people in the community whose voices are not at the table on City Council. So they went to the voters, and I think it was 60% of the area median income for council members. I think it was 75% for the mayor. I may have those numbers a little bit wrong, but I think that's directionally correct. Now, that's still not a ton of money. It's $40,000, $50,000, $60,000 a year. It's not a gob of money, but it's better than the $10,000 they were paying. Yeah. And at least that gives perspective, people who are thinking about serving the community this way, an opportunity to make a little bit more money. Maybe they can tie that to another part-time job, and they can serve the community
and make ends meet.
And make ends meet, and we're going to get a more diverse council, right, and more representative council. So I've been an advocate for that for actually long before I was on council. I would like to continue.
I'd like to leapfrog over what Fort Collins did. I think congratulations to what they did, but let's leapfrog over them.
Sure.
And,
maybe it's 100% area median. Maybe it's 100.
And then add in a one paid staff person.
Oh, that'd be nice too. Yeah, we don't have any staff. We have no offices. We have no staff, and we pay $12,000 a year. Yeah. But listen, we volunteer for this, right? And so I can't complain about it. I personally can't complain about it. But I'm looking at the next council after that. Is that council going to be representative of our community, our broader community? And right now, as much as I love my council colleagues, it's not necessarily representative of the broader community. And so
well, so then should I say is my best option is to say that can't be done, like livable wages.
That's right.
Can't be.
Challenge me. Yeah.
I don't think you can do it, Bob.
Yeah, I know. Challenge me. Well, I mean, come November, one of two things is going to happen. I'm either going to get elected mayor, in which case I can rally my council colleagues behind me, and ultimately the voters, or I'll be off council, in which case I'll be in the same situation as you, as just cheering from the sidelines. So we'll see how that goes.
All right. Well, as we mentioned in the conversation we had before this, your life may improve dramatically if you don't get elected.
I'd like to think it'll improve either way. It'll be up to the voters to decide what the next the future is.
Thank you so much for taking a long chunk of your morning to just kind of wander through a lot of different subjects, and I really appreciate your willingness to push on different things. And I have one kind of final question that I dreamed up this morning.
Okay.
In 2018, our population went up by a few hundred people. Mm-hmm. In 2019, it went down by a few hundred people. This is according to the American Community Survey.
Yeah.
In 2020, it went up by a few thousand people. Mm-hmm. In 2021, it went down by a few thousand people. And our current population, according to the latest data, is we're at pre-2016 level. And so the new American Community Survey comes out in September. It'll have updated data.
Right.
And so what's your prediction? Will the number go up or down?
I don't know. I think that these estimates are probably, they're just that, they're estimates, right? They're all probably off by a few percentages. So I wouldn't put a whole lot of stock in it. Even the U.S. Census, which is done every 10 years, the first thing they say is, this is wrong. We don't know what it is. We know this is wrong. And we're trying to make it as little wrong as possible. And so I wouldn't put a whole lot of stock in those numbers. I think it's probably fair to say over a long period of time, Boulder's population probably has not changed a lot, at least in the last 10 years. We've been hovering at slightly over 100,000.
Yeah.
There are impacts, there are some things that tend to cause our population to go up a little bit, like, for example, we continue to add housing units, right?
Yeah.
We've added historically about 200 to 300 housing units per year, each and every year for the last several years. And you say, well, geez, at the average of 2 people per housing unit, shouldn't our numbers go up 400 to 600 people per year, right?
Yeah, except that we have graduating high school classes every year.
Exactly. We have graduating high school classes every year. We have people who leave town. We have people who are aging and dying, right? And so demographics come into play. We could have, whatever we do with housing units doesn't necessarily mean that those housing units will all be full of people at the maximum level. And so our population has been relatively stable. Some people are very happy about that. Some people say Boulder is at its carrying capacity. Some people say it's not enough because we have 60,000 in commuters. Therein goes back to what we were talking about before, which is, what do we want our community to be? I would hope that everyone would say we want our community to be welcome and inclusive. I hope that would be 100% answer, right? Yeah. How we get there is where we start to fall into disagreements, right? Do we create more density, more housing opportunities, artificial government impositions about a rent? There's a whole lot of things that we can talk about. I just hope that our conversations are always positive and civil, right?
Yeah.
Now, you and I are going to disagree on some things, but we're having a very friendly conversation here, right? And I learn things from you, and I hope you learn things from me, and we'll walk away from these conversations. Maybe we have convinced the other person. But even if we haven't convinced the other person, we've at least learned something.
Yeah,
we learned a new perspective.
I hope our brains get stirred up and we spend time thinking about it.
Yeah.
And I had a conversation with Tara last week, and my wife and I went on a long walk and just processed, and so I hope that, these conversations are useful and get people thinking.
And I hope that people not only have good civil conversations and listen to each other, but I also hope that people are willing to evolve. I know that I am very different in my thinking today in 2023 than when I first got on council in 2015. And that's because I listened to the community, I listened to my colleagues, and I listened to the experiences that we were having, right? Yeah. And so I have a different view now than I did 8 years ago. I'll probably have a different view 8 years from now, right? And that's what we can't be static. We have to constantly be thinking and evolving and listening to each other and figuring out some of the best solutions for the community. And that's what being a human being is all about, is learning and growing.
And that sounds like a closer to me.
Oh, well, thank you very much. I appreciate
Thanks,
it.
Bob,
all right, good to see you.
Podcast.
All right, thanks a lot.
Gonna find me a residential pedestrian district where I can gracefully grow older. Gonna spend my remaining years sharing Boulder.
Thank you for listening to Sharing Boulder. Please support the podcast by sharing it with your friends and neighbors. You can contact me at linktree.com/Philip Ogren, which you can find by DuckDuckGoing Linktree Philip Ogren, or by visiting sharingboulder.us, where you can also find show notes and previous episodes. This episode of Sharing Boulder was produced by Philip Ogren, and the music was created by Nathaniel Ogren and Sack Lunch. Keep sharing, Boulder.